In 1984, a doctor in Perth, Australia, mixed a cloudy broth of live bacteria into a glass and drank the whole thing in one sitting. Within 5 days, he was vomiting. His breath had turned sour enough that people noticed from across a room. He kept a private diary of every symptom. He hadn't told the hospital's ethics board what he was about to do until it was already finished. His name was Barry Marshall, and what he was trying to prove had already been laughed out of a room full of senior doctors. If you've ever been handed an antacid and told your stomach pain was just stress, you were living inside a medical myth that took decades to break. For most of the 20th century, doctors were certain what caused stomach ulcers: stress, spicy food, too much acid from a nervous, high-strung lifestyle. It wasn't treated as a theory, it was doctrine taught in every medical school on Earth. If you had an ulcer, the advice was simple: relax and take an antacid for the rest of your life. Some patients had part of their stomach surgically removed entirely. By the mid-1970s, one antacid drug had become the first medication in history to earn $1 billion a year. An entire industry had been built around managing a disease with, officially, no cure. Nobody thought to look for a germ, because everybody already knew the stomach was too acidic for any bacteria to survive inside it. That much seemed obvious, beyond debate. In 1979, a pathologist named Robin Warren kept noticing something strange under his microscope: curved, spiral-shaped bacteria sitting directly on the stomach lining of ulcer patients. Colleagues told him he was probably just looking at contamination. He kept looking anyway. In 1981, a young internist named Barry Marshall joined Warren's research. Together, they examined biopsies from over 100 patients. The pattern held every time. Almost every patient with inflammation or ulcers carried the exact same curved bacteria. But they couldn't grow it in a lab dish to prove it was really alive. Attempt after attempt failed. Then, during an Easter holiday in 1982, a lab technician accidentally left a culture plate sitting out for 5 days instead of the usual 2. When she finally checked it, colonies of bacteria had grown. The mistake became the breakthrough. Marshall and Warren now had something that broke a rule considered unbreakable in medicine. A bacterium was causing the ulcers. The response from the medical establishment wasn't curiosity, it was dismissal. At a 1983 conference in Brussels, Marshall presented the theory to a room full of gastroenterologists. Out of 67 presentations that year, his was ranked dead last. Senior doctors laughed out loud. One called it the most ridiculous idea he had ever heard in his career. Journals rejected the paper. Textbooks weren't rewritten. An entire billion-dollar industry of acid-suppressing drugs had been built on the old explanation, and a 2-week course of cheap antibiotics threatened to replace medication people took for life. Marshall needed proof strong enough to override 30 years of settled consensus. The gold standard in medicine is to infect a healthy subject and watch the disease appear. Animal testing failed outright. The bacteria wouldn't take hold in pigs the way it did in people, and no ethics board was going to approve deliberately infecting a human volunteer. So Marshall decided the volunteer would be himself. He had his own stomach checked by endoscopy first, confirming it was completely healthy. No ulcer, no bacteria. Then he prepared a culture, grown from the stomach lining of an actual ulcer patient, mixed it into broth, and drank it down. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. Then the vomiting started. His breath turned sour enough that his own colleagues began to notice something was wrong, though none of them knew why. By day 10, an endoscopy confirmed it. His stomach lining was inflamed, and the exact same curved bacteria were now growing inside him. He had deliberately given himself the very disease he'd spent years trying to prove was infectious. Then he treated himself with antibiotics and recovered completely within days. It should have ended the debate immediately. It didn't. It took over a decade of additional studies, and Marshall relentlessly pushing his own research in the face of continued ridicule, before mainstream medicine finally accepted what he and Warren had shown all along. In 1994, the National Institutes of Health finally issued a formal statement. Peptic ulcers were caused by a bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, and the correct treatment was antibiotics, not a lifetime of acid suppression. Millions of patients who had spent years managing what they were told was a permanent condition could now be cured completely in about 2 weeks. In 2005, more than 2 decades after he drank that glass, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, somewhere between one lab technician's accidental 5-day mistake and one doctor swallowing a glass of live bacteria just to prove a point. An entire branch of medicine had been quietly wrong for the better part of a century, not because the evidence wasn't there to find. It was sitting under a microscope the whole time, but because nobody with enough authority was willing to look for it once the old explanation had already started to feel settled. So the next time you hear that something in science is settled, it might be worth asking a quieter question underneath it. Settled by the evidence, or just settled by how long everyone already agreed not to check. Marshall's own wife later said she knew something was wrong before he ever explained it. She just didn't know her husband had turned himself into the experiment. 1 in 10 people worldwide will develop a peptic ulcer at some point in their life. Today, most of them are cured with a short course of antibiotics, not a lifetime of pills. Warren never sought the spotlight the way Marshall did, but it was his microscope and his stubbornness that started all of it. 2 very different scientists, one at the podium and one at the bench, both refusing to let it go. It's easy looking back to call the doctors who laughed close-minded, but they were only doing what medicine had trained them to do for decades: trust the consensus. The system wasn't broken by bad people, it was slowed down by good ones being too sure. Certainty, it turns out, can be its own kind of infection, one that spreads through an entire field faster than any bacterium ever could. And the only real cure for it is the same thing that cured Marshall's own stomach: someone willing to keep looking long after everyone else had already decided to stop. Barry Marshall didn't drink that glass because he was reckless. He drank it because no one else would even look. And sometimes that's the only kind of proof that finally gets through. Not a louder argument, just a quieter kind of stubbornness, willing to outlast the laughter. Sitting right there under a microscope the whole time.